Go ahead.
Welcome. This is a global historical view of the coronavirus pandemic, a series by the Toynbee Prize Foundation. Living through historically unprecedented times has strengthened the Toynbee Prize Foundation's commitment to thinking globally about history and to representing that perspective in the public sphere. In this multimedia series on the COVID-19 pandemic, we'll be bringing global history to bear and thinking through the raging coronavirus and the range of social, intellectual, economic, political, and scientific crises triggered and aggravated by it. I'm Dr. Nicole Kuhnhinga-Boitis, Executive Director of the Toynbee Prize Foundation and Research Fellow at Cambridge. Today, I have the great pleasure of speaking to Selçuk Esenbel, one of the esteemed trustees of the Toynbee Prize Foundation and Professor of History at Boğaziçi University. Professor Esenbel earned her PhD in Japanese history from Columbia University and teaches Asian and Japanese history at Boğaziçi University, where she also heads the Asian Studies Center as its director. She has received a multitude of awards, including the Order of the Rising Sun, and her research interests include Japan and the world of Islam, Japanese pan-Asianism, modernization in Japan and Ottoman Turkey, and Japanese, Ottoman, and Turkish relations. Thank you for taking the time to join us today from Istanbul.
Well, thank you very much for this opportunity. I think that, we're having meaningful conversations these days. This is one of the few optimist notes of the lethal COVID-19, epidemic, that now human communication and meaningful conversations has become so much more important. So this is a great opportunity to talk to you and to talk to those people, who are listening into the interview and the Toynbee Prize Foundation to have made it possible.
I agree. Thank you so much. I was wondering if you could begin by talking to us. You mentioned to me just a moment ago about the need to return to the classic 18th century conception of nature, and that being related to what you believe you've learned and what the epidemic teaches us. Could you elaborate?
Well, I think that, as human beings, we've become too arrogant in the last 30, 40 years in thinking that everything that we think and everything that we encounter is simply a product of the human imagination. Therefore, we can change it, we can manipulate it, it has been manipulated, and therefore for us to decipher that manipulation has given us great self-satisfaction. Well, I'm sorry. We're living in an environment which is millions of years old, and it has its own reason. Nature has its own reason. And therefore, for us to assume as human beings, as a part of, living nature, the arrogance that, we can dismiss the logic of nature in our contemplation of human society and human behavior. I think that this epidemic, although unfortunately it is creating human, losses all around the world at unprecedented levels, is, if there's a lesson to be learned, that's what it is. That for us to continue our way of life, our mode of production, our, sustenance, anything, we have to factor in the reason of nature, and we have to respect it. We do not have the right to destroy, to exploit, and simply move on, making havoc of the natural environment for the sake of profit, for the sake of globalization, because I think that, having disturbed the way in which nature works, now we're being punished for it. I'm not using some kind of reference to a spirituality that's punishing us. I'm saying we are, suffering through the consequences of our behavior. In other words, I really started feeling this actually before the COVID-19, pandemic, maybe in the last 10 years or so, that globalization has taken such a frenzied, I really think that it's very important for us to, as a global humanity, to take a lesson from this. It's almost like the period right after the destruction of the Second World War. God forbid, we don't want at all those kind of, casualties and deaths. I mean, this is out of the question. That's not what I mean. But, the global order was destroyed at the end of the Second World War, and therefore it had to be reconstructed again. And some of that reconstruction, maybe, if not all of it, some of that reconstruction did take into heart the lessons that led to the Second World War. Nothing was perfect, of course. Human behavior is not perfect. But, even political interest, state, ambitions, competition between major global powers such as the United States and the Soviet Union and all of that factored in still. The post-war period is not the same as the pre-war period. There are more, checks and balances that were infused into the systems that was being reconstructed. Now, I think that, with globalization, it began as a beautiful, dream that economy, finance, technology will create a global village. We'll all live happily ever after in this global commune, if you will, withering away of the state. Marx kind of reinterpreted in a peculiar way for the sake of capitalism's, prevalence. But unfortunately, I think that lessons learned, it shows us that we need state regulation. We need public institutions. In the end of the day, the market doesn't cure us. Once we catch the corona or COVID-19 virus, you need good public health care. You need doctors. You need medical education. You can't farm it out, fly patients to some corner of the world where the labor of medical profession is cheap. You can't do that. I'm not thinking that we're going to go back to the isolated nation state, sort of self-centeredness of the 1950s or maybe 60s, but at least I think that the public institutions of countries, whatever you want to call it, if you don't want to use the word nation state, you can call it something else, the public institutions of a defined, territory, has the responsibility of creating better healthcare, better living conditions, and those institutions, as well as, the people themselves, have to bring in nature and respect to nature, the natural environment, in terms of not disturbing it too much because of our ambition for production. We have to do this. I mean, otherwise, I think it's going to be one corona over another, maybe some other epidemic, Historically, I think that's the lesson that needs to be learned, that nature has to be brought back into every single calculation, every single policy, every single analysis of, human society.
Yeah. And that actually reminded me, as an expert in the history of modernization in Japan, was there an operative concept of nature that attended those discussions and debates, as well as that process?
At the moment, you mean if you're asking about the contemporary discussion?
Oh, I meant historically, but
historically, Confucianism certainly has a very strong concept of nature, because heaven, as you know, rules human society and nature at the same time. And it's not the same as a sort of contemporary environmentalist or naturalist argument maybe, but it certainly factored in nature, just like the 18th century philosophers in Europe. Confucianism has had a tradition of always incorporating nature, and that we have to live in harmony with it in some way. Some way. And of course, the Islamic religion also had a very important, concept of nature factored into its theology as well, because human beings are maybe the most, noble God's creation, but they are part of nature. They are maybe the most sovereign and noble creatures, but they are part of nature, and they have their own mind with which to live and make decisions in that context. They don't have the right to destroy things just because they're human beings. That's the whole point. I think that every philosophical discussion has always incorporated nature into its analysis. We have to do that again. And we have to do that again for human survival. This is not just some, elegant intellectual argumentation. We have to do that in our policies, not just some debate, intellectually.
Yeah, absolutely. I was also wondering how you would situate this moment with the coronavirus within the histories of globalism in Japan and the thinking through of globalism or internationalism. You just mentioned the global village.
Well, I think that, since Japan is certainly not an isolated corner completely of global history, that would be wrong. Yes, they lived through a period of very interesting sakoku, which was actually not complete isolation. I mean, they did have regular relations with Holland and a little indirect relations with China and with Korea as well. But still, of course, it was, in the end of the day, some kind of, conscious decision to close the doors of Japan to international interaction for various reasons, as you know very well. So it has had a history of being relatively isolated, from the outside environment. But Japan's history is part of global history as well. So in my opinion, I think that the Japanese experience of the quick modernizing upheaval of their environment during the Meiji period, especially during the Taisho and Showa period, with absolute disregard to nature. Remember the terrible working conditions, of urban labor, male and female labor in Japan's industries in the 20th century, which was partly the reason why there was such a social, discontent and frustration in Japanese society before the war, which fed into various political movements. And remember, in the early post-war period, the Minamata, poisoning of total disregard to human health and human living conditions. So the Japanese today, of course, no longer have that kind of totally exploitive attitude towards nature. Even Japanese capital and Japanese, industrial circles have had to, improve, shall we say, their, production processes, even if it's not perfect. I grew up in Japan in the 1960s as a young woman. I was a high school student first, later on a college student. We could never see the blue skies in Tokyo. It was always yellow. And whenever you saw the blue skies, people would call each other and say, hey, look outside, the sky is blue, wow. So I probably lived through the most polluted phase of Japan's post-war reconstruction. When I returned back to Japan in the mid-70s, the skies were blue. That's something to give credit for.
Yep.
Unleaded gas, filtering of factory chimneys, moving industries out of the centers of big cities, and cleaning up the air and so on. This may not have been perfect, and there are many Japanese environmentalists who are critical of the insufficiency of public policy towards environmental production. But compared to my youth, I mean, it was really an unbelievable improvement. So, in other words, what I'm saying is societies can learn, we have the capacity to think. And it shouldn't be used simply for mindless self-interest, like we want to make money. We want to go global. We don't care how the people live in Wuhan. We don't care if we move, thousands of people as workers from that environment to some other environment. And we're just interested in the cheap labor. We're interested in the efficiency of production. I'm sorry. This has become humanly self-destructive, and it shouldn't be allowed to continue, is my opinion.
Right. On the point about environmental change in Japan, I was wondering because in a similar time period in the US, the Great Lakes were basically considered dead in the 1970s, I believe, 1960s or 1970s.
Yes.
The quality of the water was so poor. And today they're thriving, but the change wasn't that there was better laws or better regulation. It's just that industry moved to developing countries. So you essentially outsourced the pollution. And so it's not a net benefit to the earth. It's just the privileged, richer countries get to enjoy the landscape.
Exactly. So that's
how.
unfair.
Anything at work in Japan that accounted for that change that you saw, something similar to that?
Well, I mean, 70s, I think that we should give credit to Japanese stricter regulation. Because 70s, they were still producing most of their industrial production in Japan.
Yeah.
It is after the 80s that Japanese business, whole scale, moved to China.
Yeah.
To other parts of the world because of, as you said, convenient and profitable labor capital relations, And I think that this is also proven to be wrong. You see, you can't just move your factories to China and disregard the conditions in which the Chinese people are living and then complain because some kind of, virus unexpectedly erupts in a certain corner, of a city, and then is transported because we're mindlessly taking the airplane. We're constantly using the airplane as if the airplane is a bicycle or, a taxi or something. Well, then maybe everything has to be considered from bottom up. I started feeling this. I remember it's emotional, maybe. We're all guilty. I started taking, flights all over the world because of the global academy, running from Japan to China to Germany to United States. And then at some point about, 4 or 5 years ago, I was in the middle of a flight going somewhere and, flight attendants and everybody does acknowledge the fact that it's never possible to totally clean the airplane environment. I mean, you do the best you can. It's the same with hospitals.
Yeah.
There are viruses that live contained in those environments, when there are too many numbers of ill people maybe passing through. So, and then, it's like saying, I'm subjecting myself to 10 hours of potential infection by sitting in the airplane. Well, maybe I should take the train or something. Or maybe move to a sort of slower way of, transportation. Or maybe we have to upgrade. We have to develop new technology, which is truly going to, keep the air absolutely fresh and clean, even if you are in the airplane for 10 or 15 hours, you see? I mean, it's lessons to be learned here. Yeah. Our form of mindless mobility and disregard to the conditions of production in a region for the sake of global interest, that combination has proven to be a mistake.
Yeah. What you just said reminded me actually about some of the privileges and the obstacles to doing global history, which is basically that it requires this kind of mobility that you can flit from archive to archive in order to obtain a more global perspective. And that has a privilege embedded in it, as we all know. And there might be an opportunity as we rethink this kind of globality to level the playing field, as it were, and to make it such that it isn't merely the privileged few who can work in multi-archivally. There's some manner in which we can obtain a global understanding without forsaking our kind of commitments to the environment and to this kind of unthinking movement. I'm not sure what that would look like, but there could be an opportunity.
I think it's not like, I'm not saying that we should stop doing what we're doing, but we have to slow down.
Yeah.
And go deeper.
Yeah.
You're going to use your, regional archive,
Yeah.
but you're not going to do it in a kind of sort of frenzied manner of, oops, I'm just hopping in here 15 days and then from there skipping over there. No, we have to go back to a slower momentum of research and go deeper.
Yeah.
Rather than skimming over the surface. In other words, we've got it. I think there was also a lot of superficiality sometimes. Running around.
Yeah.
Well, was it every single one of your encounters of any profound importance? Really? Let's confess.
Yeah.
Not really. A few of them, yes, absolutely. But not all of the encounters in that, frenzied mobility was of any significance, of staying power. So we have to be, I think, we have to use more discretion and discrimination and maybe relearn how to go deeper.
Yeah.
Relearn how to go deeper, Slow down the momentum for quality.
Yeah.
Rather than quantity,
yeah.
It should be quality. That should be inspirational in our research.
Yeah. Another thing I wanted to ask you about, because you talked about sort of responsibility, is there a way in which you see the crisis reframing historical debates or traditions around rights and responsibilities in Japan or in Turkey for that matter?
About what was your last sentence?
Historical debates around rights and responsibilities and the balance between rights, individual rights, and public responsibilities or individual responsibilities.
Well, on my part, at least the awareness that I have gained, from all of this and from observing the production of historical literature over the last 20 years is that we have to factor in public decision-making and public policy and public institutions as a very significant component of historical transformation globally, mind you. So, because it shows how important public institutional framework, and it's people, people are the ones who produce public institutions. It doesn't come from outer space. So, we have to factor in the significance. When public institutions work well, it is for the benefit of, human beings.
Yeah.
And when they don't work well, and when they curtail, individual liberty, rights, we see all over today, global trend towards authoritarianism, remember? We're living through that. You can use public institutions in a good way, you can use it in a bad way. But they are important. You can't dismiss it.
Yeah.
You can't dismiss it. In the end of the day, you can't dismiss it.
On that note, what in your sort of observations do you think the pandemic may portend in terms of the politics of intense nationalism or the right in Japan or in Turkey or globally?
Well, I'm just sort of scared of that, because when I say the nation state, I call it the public institutions of a defined territory. I think that's a nice way of saying it. Sort of kind of intellectually engaging with my own self, I suppose. But what do you call that, that is, its importance has certainly come to the forefront. I just hope that it doesn't lead to irrational nationalism of shutting down the doors of, countries to each other and weakening the sense of cooperation and collaboration that ought to exist between countries. And it doesn't shut down completely. I don't use the term, it shouldn't shut down global trade. I'm sort of, shall we say, a little frustrated about this trade emphasis that we have. Human communication is not just doing business. Business is important, but we've seen now that, it's other kinds of human communication are also important. So we don't want the global system to collapse, no. But there's certainly going to be, I think, much more of a, whether we like it or not, nation first, perspective that emerges. I'm concerned about that because when that is taken to an extreme, then it will lead to just simply the old kind of, competition between nationalist polities. We don't want that either. So we have to find a way. We simply have to find a way. In other words, an institution like the European Union is a very important institution. It's a very important historic experiment of bringing in checks and balances to extreme nationalism that destroyed the European environment twice in the 20th century and cost millions and millions of people to die. The death count of the Second World War alone in the European theater is 50 million people who died. I mean, it's difficult to understand what that means, the statistics, it's so big. So we never want to go back to an environment where that kind of, unbridled nationalist competition is going to create a very serious, shall we say, conflictual global environment. We would want the checks and balances of, the behavior of nation states, if you will. But compared to the 90s or the 2000s, I think that certainly the attitude of countries and the publics in those countries will be more nation-oriented. Whether we like it or not, that's how it's going to be. We've seen this in the COVID-19 crisis in Europe, and it's kind of like, it's the virus in a way has had a remarkable effect in taking a photograph of the conditions in each country and to show its weaknesses. I was expecting that the medical profession, because maybe we think that the European Union has solved everything, being from Turkey that wants to, complete the session, the sort of romanticized view maybe, that the medical, infrastructure of countries such as France and Italy would be so much better. I was expecting that. And it shows a fragility. And the same thing goes for, New York, or for Washington, D.C., or for Chicago. So obviously money was used for other things during the great profit-making economy since the 90s. Money was being used for other things. In other words, that's a lesson to be learned. That's a lesson to be taken, I mean, it's like we're seeing the X-ray, internal organs of, societies, and we see the weaknesses, surprising weaknesses, and this is the same everywhere. It's the same in Japan, it's the same in Turkey. In Turkey, for example, social culture is so Mediterranean, people like to talk to each other all the time. And so that's a big problem. You can't keep people respect what is called social distancing. The doctors want you to do, but it's very difficult to get people to do that, you see? And all kinds of problems, so we're seeing, very realistic photographs, and on an optimistic note, maybe these photographs will lead us to, solve those problems.
Yeah.
I'm sure I'm sure, some people will think, okay, we've got to solve this problem for the next time around. We have to be more prepared. We have to have more masks. I mean, it's not as simple as that, but our medical institutions have to be stronger.
Yeah. I like that
It's a,
metaphor of the X-ray.
yeah, it's a lesson to be learned.
For my final question, I was wondering if you, what you thought the apt historical comparison is that we should draw to illuminate our current period.
The plague originated in East Asia as well, as you know. And historians tell us that it was rodents, but also the Mongol armies that carried it very swiftly across Eurasia. So that was the globalization of the 13th century.
Indeed.
I don't think the Mongols were pretty much concerned about what they were carrying. They were interested in world empire, we've got to conquer, that kind of stuff. But the point is, that was also a kind of globalization. And many historians also today note from a positive point that the Mongol army quickened the economic globalization of Eurasia, encouraged commercialization because it made the Silk Road, connection between different regions more secure and more, facilitated because the Mongols were interested. They like business. They don't like agriculture, but they like business, So, in other words, it reminds me of the plague. I just, God forbid, we don't want the consequences to be like the plague. No, I mean, we have a much better, I think, scientific and medical, experience today. I mean, it's in no ways comparable to medieval 13th century, but it is sort of like the plague in the sense that it reveals the underside, the weakness of human behavior, which has to be overcome. People have had to learn how to live in an environment where they can, protect themselves more, from infections like this. So the plague, I think, the consequences, European history was never the same.
Yep.
It doesn't matter. Chinese history was never the same, but European history, especially because there was such a great, percentage of casualties, of deaths because of the plague. People have debated ever since Perry Anderson and others about, how it also affected even wage levels and the relations between, the seigneurs and the serfs and the scarcity of labor led to wage increase. I remember all these arguments, from different commentators and academic, observers of the effects of the plague. But it's a rough analogy, but I think like the plague, the COVID-19 or coronavirus is going to have that kind of a global effect, some kind of a global effect.
Yeah.
We're not going to go back
Yeah.
to how we lived 2 years ago. We're not going to, just say, okay, let's, go back to our old way of life. Never. It's going to be permanently changed.
I liked too very much what you mentioned to me earlier of the comparison to the 20s.
Yes, the Roaring Twenties. Remember the Roaring Twenties? Irresponsible speculation in the market led to, the Great Depression, 1929. It's a very rough analogy, but I think that we lived the Roaring Twenties during the globalization, frenzy. And this is sort of got to put a stop to that. Put a stop to that kind of mindless, human self-confidence that you can imagine everything, and that is the truth, and that's it. There is a reality of nature out there, and it has its own logic, and it's merciless. You see, it's merciless. Mercy is a human, value. The concept of mercy. Nature has no mercy. Nature has its own logic. It's noble, but it has no mercy. How about the dolphins? Footnote. Well, optimist scenario. You know, everybody's so happy in Istanbul right now because the dolphins are back. We have thousands of dolphins. We've had dolphins in the Marmara Sea and in the Bosphorus since ancient Greece. I mean, antiquity. Okay, it's part of the nature here, and you could still see dolphins in the Marmara Sea, but they no longer appeared in the Golden Horn, the famous bay, you know, which shines sort of golden as the sun sets over it, you know, at night. And that's why the Europeans called it the Golden Horn, because it kind of has a horn type of, you know, it's like a cow's head with horns, superficially speaking. And it does shine brilliantly, you know, with rays of gold, you know, as the sun sets. Okay, dolphins are back in the bay. They're frolicking all over. So everybody's sending videos to each other saying, you know, the last time they were seen in, you know, the Golden Horn was during the Ottoman period.
That's amazing.
And before the 19th century, because the 19th century, the industries and the big navy in the Golden Horn, I'm sorry, created a very inhospitable environment for the dolphins. So they moved out of it. Now they are in the bay. So that tells you something.
Yeah.
Nature is out there and is willing to give you a good life if you allow it. If you allow, the past isn't gone. The past isn't dead as we assume it to be. We can bring back the past. It's there, hidden in the corners of the present, you know, and we can sort of reconstruct it that way.
Well, here's to hoping.
Yes.
Thank you so much for lending us your expertise and your thoughts today.
Okay. Well, I enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. I've also heard word of swans in Venice and otters in Singapore. So here's to hoping that nature does reclaim it.
Exactly. So that is teaching us a lesson.
Yeah.
You know, that is teaching us a lesson. Absolutely.
Let's hope that we learn it. Thank you so much.
Okay. Take care.
Bye.